what action the committee should take to, and I didn't get a chance to talk to anyone offline about this just because of the size of the whole agenda, but should we be bringing in each department to ask them why their compliance rate is so low? That's my first inclination, or is there a better way to do it?
Well, I think that would be for the city to answer. We've tried to highlight where the recommendations haven't been implemented. Union Station, of course, IT, facilities management, and the cleaning contracts. And then the benefits. So I think it's a question for management. We've tried to do what we could do to highlight it, but there may be additional context that the management can provide.
So then I guess next question is of the city manager. When we see this level of compliance, should we be, I'll give you two options, there might be a third that's better. Should we be bringing in the departments to explain themselves, or should we be kicking it to you to maybe move them along and get back to us?
So if I can, through the chair, we are working with our own internal audit, are going to be looking at all the recommendations that are partially or not started, and we're going to be tracking those, and we'll be asking the organization to address them. And we want to report that to you quarterly so that you have an idea of what progress we are in fact making on those outstanding items. That way we can hold management accountable for taking seriously the recommendations that the AG is meeting. So that's something that I will be undertaking myself through audit, ensuring that we have, not just in one area, but right across the entire organization, we have a consistent approach to dealing with dealing with the AG's recommendations.
Okay, thank you. And just one more question of the Auditor General. There was one thing in here that was kind of startling, but there was no context for it. So it talked about, we noted that Real Estate Services negotiated a settlement with one occupant that was approximately 1.9 million less than the amount staff originally sent to the occupant in 2016. I don't know whether that, and maybe it's in here, and I didn't see it, but I don't know whether that's 1.9 million out of 2 million or out of 10 million. And is there a story behind that we should know?
I'm going to turn that to my Assistant Auditor General.
Through the chair, the original audit, when we did the audit, there were no settlements of the Union Station occupants of operating costs had not been done for a number of years. And so when we had put forth the initial estimates, this specific occupant, it was based on facilities management's original opening position with that occupant, and then they went back and reviewed agreements and interpretations of agreement, and then this was the number that they settled on.
But was it brought to our attention because it looked like a ludicrous settlement, or just to note that it was a high amount?
It was to note the difference of what was reported originally in our original report and what ended up being settled. The difference between what we had reported and what ended up being settled upon.
And sorry, the amount that was reported on again was?
Pardon me, sorry.
The settlement was 1.9. What was the amount that was owed?
Through the chair, I think it was 2.1 or 2.2 million was originally at the time of the audit in 2016. And then the final settlement amount was around 300,000, I believe.
Was that reported out anywhere?
Yes, through the chair. It would be reported through our variance reporting or through the budget process is where it would have been reported. As well as through these documents, and I'm not 100% sure if that was reported through the Auditor General's update through the last budget process or not. I wouldn't know that off the top of my head.
So who would have, and I'm not, I know nothing about this transaction, so I'm not questioning whether it was a good settlement or not, but who would, just kind of the process, who would sign off on that? It looks like it was not a committee that would sign off on it, so who would sign off on that?
So through the chair, so I guess at the divisional level, it would be signed off through a consultation and review with legal services and other partner city divisions, and anyone else that was involved in the either negotiation or settlement with the tenant.
So I'm looking for either a committee or a, fairly senior management person that would sign off on something where you're forgiving, very large percentage of what was owed. Where would the authority for that lie?
Through the chair, the final settlement was signed off by the director of real estate or the division head for real estate services, and the amounts would have been, I guess, refined from the original submission in 2016.
Okay, thank you.
Through the chair, I just wanted to verify. It was through complete consultation with legal. I just wanted to make sure people understood that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Fillion. Are there any other members of council wishing to ask questions on this item? Seeing none, are there members wishing to speak?
Yes, and I
Fillion?
have a motion that I haven't got back from clerks yet. No, sorry, not this motion. It's the other one. Maybe I did get it, but I don't see it here. Yeah, okay, good, thank you. So I have a motion. I don't know whether it overlaps with Councillor Nunziata's or not, so if it does, we'll straighten it out.
Yeah, this is mine.
Okay, no, they're complementary, not overlapping.
They are.
So my motion is that the audit committee recommend that City Council request the city manager to report to City Council through the audit committee on the following: A, steps in providing effective mechanisms for management to be held accountable for implementing within reasonable and identified timelines measures which they have agreed to take in order to implement recommendations from the Auditor General, and B, ensuring appropriate consequences when information provided to the Auditor General is not fully accurate. So it sounds to me like the city manager is on top of this. I'm expecting that by the end of this term, we will see a lot more accountability in this organization. I also hope for world peace by then, but I think this one is a bit more achievable because we do have control over it, and things that we have control over may never be perfect, but they can certainly be a lot better than they currently are.
Thank you, Councillor Fillion. Councillor Nunziata, you wish to speak?
Yes, I just want to move my motion, and I agree with Councillor Fillion. And it's on the screen that the audit committee direct the city manager to report to the audit committee in first quarter of 2020 with an update on the implementation of all outstanding recommendations for city divisions and corporate services and finance and treasury services, with the report to include detailed plans and timelines for implementation of all recommendations not yet fully implemented.
Are there any other members wishing to speak? Seeing none, We'll vote on Councillor Filian's amendment. All those in favor? Any opposed? That is carried. And we'll also vote on Councillor Nunziata's amendment. All of those in favor? Any opposed? And that is carried. And on the item as amended, all of those in favor? Any opposed? And that is carried. Okay, we are on to AU 4.4, Toronto Transit Commission's Revenue Operations, Phase 2, Presto, TTC, Fare Equipment, and Presto Revenue. Just check to see, are there members with questions on that? I think we cleared that up, that there weren't any. Are there any members wishing to speak on this particular item? With not, I'll take an opportunity. I do have a motion on it, fairly straightforward. Ask the clerk to put that on the screen. So it's rather wordy, but I'll boil it down to, this was a comprehensive report, well over 100 pages. It was dealt with at TTC yesterday extensively. I'm sure all audit committee members enjoyed reading it and the findings and the importance of it. But one thing that stood out to me in the report was there was a small section that talked about the differentiation with child cards in appearance and some of the following steps around the technicals around the sound and how they're activated on the card readers were not necessarily completed. And I recall back to the original handling of the first audit on TTC revenue and fare inspection, fare evasion, and that was a very strong finding of the Auditor General. And so the purpose of this motion is twofold. The first is to ask the Toronto Transit Commission to put on the agenda of the Joint Executive Committee, which is something that was spoken to in the report about the need for restarting and using that committee to its full extent to deal with this item on child and other concession card appearances. And then the second is, and I know we've asked for this in the past, and I'm not sure all of it has followed through, but to reiterate or to direct the city manager to write to Metrolinx to ask that the change be made to the child cards immediately. Because we know what the other audit said, and we know that this audit talks about the mechanisms in which such a change would take place. I hope you'll support that, and with that, I will check to make sure there's anyone else wishing to speak. Seeing none, on my amendment, all those in favor? Any opposed? And that is carried. And finally, on the item as amended, all in favor? Any opposed? And that is carried. AU 4.5, Safeguarding Rent Geared to Income Assistance, ensuring only eligible people benefit. So we do have a speaker. And that's Mark Richardson. Mark, I think you've been here before. Welcome back.
I was here the last auditor's report on the rent geared to income wait list.
Thank you. So you know the rules and you've got 5 minutes.
Yep.
Are you ready to go? Do you need a moment?
Yeah, I think I'm ready to go here. See my screen? Yep, we're good to go. Awesome.
Very good.
So councillors, I'm Mark Richardson from housingnowto.com, here to speak today about the rent geared to income assistance audit. As you're probably aware, we are a group that has been working to improve the data collection, quality, and presentation around your affordable housing programs. We launched a map of the Mayor's Housing Now sites back in January of this year, and we've already reached 26,000 visitors to that site. It's free, it's public, and to align with what the auditors team does here, we're public, we're open, we're about clarity of information, we're about transparency of process, and we're about tracking against targets. And we'd like to thank the auditor for the work on this file because it's really been exceptional. I don't want to steal the auditor's thunder, but there's a bunch of really good points here in this rent geared to income list. There are indicators that ineligible people are not consistently being identified or acted on when it comes to rent geared to income, that households are not always disclosing their property ownership as required by law. Households may have unreported sources of income and assets. Some rent geared to income households are likely subletting their units. There is irregular, altered, or falsified documents. You have weak oversight of your housing providers. And the last two at the bottom here. There is no central system to capture data requirements for rent geared to income households. And the city does not know who is receiving rent geared to income assistance, even though this is key information to stewardship over your funds. This really ties in to the previous auditor's report. We were here in June. We were talking about the housing wait list at that time, where you're still sending paper, physical snail mail out to people. Before that, you were talking about tree audits, where people were still filling in paper log sheets about what they do during their day. And a couple of years ago, the auditor was having to drive around the city picking up boxes of paper documents from paving contracts around the city. You've got a core problem here, which is more paper means more problems in the city. And we need to find a way to get away from paper. Right now, under the Open Doors program, you have a paper-based housing lottery going on. It's open right now, so if you're doing your newsletters out to your constituents and stuff, you should let them know that they have 3 weeks to apply for 33 housing units that are available. There are 3-bedroom units going for $1,300 a month. There are 2-bedroom units going for $1,200 a month. The challenge is that this information is still being done on a paper-based system. You fill in a paper form, that paper form gets sent in. Toronto started a recap of one of them that you had last year. You had almost 4,000 people expressed interest. You had 2,700 applications that were complete and eligible. So right in that first cut, you lost 26% of your applicants because you're doing it on paper. That was for a competition for 75 of these housing lottery units. Right now, the Toronto Community Housing is managing these lists in Microsoft Excel. And as you can see in the picture there, the way they audit the integrity of it is by having somebody shoot a video on an iPhone while they are sorting the Excel spreadsheet. This is not fit for purpose. You're about to create 40,000 units of affordable housing. This solution will not scale. So we want you to fix the problem and kill the paper. Commit to moving all city processes to digital. Mr. Etta was out here this morning already. If there's a paper-based process somewhere in the city, hunt and kill it. Mandate and fund a kill the paper policy for the city manager, the CTO, and all your division heads. Mandate and fund an IT evergreening policy for the city manager, CTO, and all division heads to replace your ancient systems. And these bottom 3, if somebody was looking to move a motion, these bottom 3 cost you nothing. They're just best practices. Apply every recommendation from today's Auditor General's report on rent geared to income to the housing lottery process, Housing Now and Open Doors sites. Look to global best practices from other cities. And as we say every time, engage the civic tech, the open data, and the design thinking communities on fixing the housing process around rent geared to income and the housing lottery. 452. That's how you do it. Thank you.
Very impressive. Landing a jumbo jet on a postage stamp, right?
Yes.
5 minutes, 4:52. Thanks for talking to us. With that, I'll ask committee members if there are any questions. I do have one, I think. So you didn't talk about it exactly in your presentation, but in the report today, the auditor raises a very important public policy question. And that is, how do you account for assets when looking at the position on a list? As someone mentioned to me, you know, like you could drive a Lamborghini and still put yourself on the list because it's focused on income as opposed to what you've got and what you own. And I wondered, you're familiar with the data world, the sources of data, in particular open data. if council goes through and begins to look at that particular policy piece, do you have any recommendations on where we could go to get information on assets?
I believe you have some information around that that's available to you when you're applying for other kinds of benefits. So if you're applying for child benefits or student loans and things, you have to disclose that information. I think part of your challenge is that you actually don't have the legislative mandate to require that information, and I don't know whether that comes from a federal level or from the province. There are certainly things that you can write into your legislation that require electronic disclosure of information. One of the things the Auditor General talks about in this report is people who are clearly faking bank stubs when they're submitting paperwork. So the fact that you could ask for, I want your electronic version of your T4, I want your electronic version, or I want access to it from a authoritative source. But assets is very, very hard because sometimes the asset may not even be in the country.
Well, there's a difference between auditing and performing, the standard qualification function that a clerk would go through when they're assessing that. Are there other sources that could be searched? And I take to note, I think there was an example in here where the auditor talked about property ownership. There's a very specific example about the disposal of the property and the date around the qualification. But if you played it out further, you think about it, somebody could apply for RGI and own 3 houses in Alberta and BC. And we wouldn't know that. But is there a way
Well,
that
actually, in Alberta and BC, you would, because in Alberta and BC, assessment information is public.
My point
In
exactly.
Ontario, because we've decided instead that we go through this MPAC structure, all that information is siloed and hidden behind a paid firewall. So you would have better luck going to BC assessments and Alberta assessments to find property ownership there than you would here in the province of Ontario.
But I guess the point I want to make is the legislation and the policy aside, there is information out there for the taking that's a fairly low bar, right?
Yep.
Maybe you pay a fee to get it or you just search.
Yeah,
But it's
I
out
would
there and it would
think
help.
that you would be able to pay a fee to get it in many cases, or you enter into agreements with other government agencies in order to be able to do that. I mean, the government of Canada has FinTrack, which is used for identifying unusual bank transfers. Whether it would be deemed compliant for you to be able to access that kind of information for qualifying people for benefits is a totally different question. Right now, it's
Understood.
only used for enforcement.
Would you say, and I'm going to wrap it up here, would you say there are any sources out there that are of high value to tackle this question?
Off the top of my head, no.
Okay.
But our contact information is on the front end of these slides. We are always happy to throw our nerds at those kinds of questions and put it out for a crowdsourced answer.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Welcome Ina Chan and Bruno Galali, both from the Auditor General's office. You'll be delivering a presentation for us. So you're ready to go as soon as you're ready to go.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of Audit Committee. With me is Bruno Gale, and also the team is also here, Bruno Corbesi and Celia Tao, as well as a number of our staff who participated in our on-site file reviews with various providers. In our presentation, you have the full slide deck. We're not going to go through all the slides. but we'll give you a quick background on our project, the audit objectives and scope, the key themes identified from our audit, and at a very high level, key audit findings and recommendations. We will go through those very quickly, and so if there's any slides that you want us to discuss further, we can always come back to them if you have questions. Our office is conducting a series of audits along the housing continuum. In our last audit, Opening Doors to Stable Housing, we identified opportunities to more effectively manage the centralized social housing wait list. This audit focuses on the administration of RGI and the verification of each household's ongoing eligibility for RGI assistance. Although we expect the vast majority of people receiving RGI are eligible, some people who currently receive RGI assistance may not be. Given the shortage of social housing, the city must ensure that eligible people with the greatest need are prioritized. The city is the designated service manager under the Housing Services Act and is responsible for administering RGI in Toronto. As highlighted in the map on the slide, the city has delegated RGI administration to over 200 housing providers spread out across the city. Regardless, the city is ultimately accountable for any delegated duties, including ensuring that those receiving assistance are eligible. So in our audit, we had 3 questions that we wanted to answer. Are people who are receiving subsidized housing eligible? 2, given the current decentralized delegated structure where providers are the main line of defense, is sufficient due diligence being exercised in their eligibility reviews? And 3rd, is the city's oversight and support of providers sufficient to ensure that the providers are following the legislation and the city's policies for RGI administration? So the issues and recommendations can be categorized in 3 key themes. First, the city needs to be sure that potential eligibility issues are identified and addressed. Second, the city needs to have greater involvement and take greater responsibility for key aspects of RGI administration to better support their providers by, 1, verifying eligibility before and at the time someone gains access to RGI housing assistance, preventing ineligible households from accessing subsidized housing in the first place. It's much harder to address eligibility concerns once somebody occupies a unit. Second, accessing, analyzing, and providing data to its providers to highlight risk indicators that may impact eligibility. And 3rd, centrally investigating problem files. So by enabling providers who may not have the capacity to be able to refer files they have concerns with for further eligibility review and investigation by the city. And the 3rd theme is to expand integration of income-based subsidy programs to create efficiencies in eligibility verification and addressing potential fraud, suspected fraud through increased information sharing, recommendations that we had previously made in 2014. What is important is that the city needs to provide better support to its housing providers so that together they can ensure only those who are eligible are receiving RGI assistance. Bruno is going to take you through some of our main findings on indicators of potential RGI ineligibility.
Thank you, Ina. The first theme of our audit looked at how the city needs to be sure that potential eligibility issues are identified and addressed. During our audit, we identified households with indicators that may impact their eligibility for RGI assistance. This includes potential unreported property ownership, potential unreported income or assets, potential unreported occupants of RGI units or subletting, and inconsistent information or potential irregular documents. And we'll go through each of these in the next few slides. It is important to note that these findings were not isolated to one provider. They were present across most providers we reviewed. During our audit, we identified over 500 RGI households who appear to have been linked to properties within Toronto. We reviewed a sample of 60 of these households and found that approximately 15% owned properties. Some of these examples are in our report. In most of the examples, the properties were not disclosed and continue to be held by the households at the time of our audit. Also, in the sample of files we reviewed, approximately 18% had indicators of potential unreported sources of income or assets, including regular or significant deposits into the account, which may indicate income or other payments, and transfers to other bank accounts and investment accounts. In many cases, there is limited evidence on file to indicate that staff identified or asked the right questions to probe the reasonableness of information provided by households. Even where questions appear to have been asked, the follow-up actions were not timely or documented. Any unreported income means the tenant will be undercharged rent.
Councillor Nunziata has informed me that she's got some conflicting duties. And I know other committee members have expressed a bit of a crunch on time. And the city manager and staff. So the request maybe forward from the committee is, given the time that we've got, could we condense the presentation a little bit? We still have to hear from staff and there'll be some questions on it.
I think the big slide, the most important one, can we just go over one of them? For slide on page 21, Ina, which is the go forward, what we recommend to centralize the system. I think if you explain the diagram, it might be helpful, and then from there we should tidy up.
Okay, so one of the key themes is that the city should take a more central role. So it's our view that it would be more effective and efficient for the city to take greater responsibility for confirming eligibility and verifying income and assets when households are applying for and obtaining access to RGI assistance. By directly performing the initial review, the city can ensure that only eligible households are gaining access, preventing eligibility issues before they occur. We also recommend enhancing the quality of reviews by leveraging data from multiple sources. So this will enable the city to be able to more effectively identify potential RGI eligibility issues that need to be followed up. And then having a centralized system to collect and maintain data would allow the city and the providers to have easy access to electronic records and enable the city to have more efficient and effective review and monitoring of household eligibility.
So just to summarize, it's important to be receiving, for people who are receiving RGI, that they be eligible. And we recommend, in coordination with our first report, that the continued centralization and automation of the eligibility reviews happen up front as people are on the list, and that the information be centrally coordinated for analysis to make sure people are eligible when they go into RGI units. We also recommended additional powers for the service provider to make sure that, and they have the ability to have those, to make sure that they're able to track down and make sure that those who are eligible can show that they are, in case there's any questions with the property ownership. Okay.
Thank you. I know that we have a very brief presentation from staff, and I think it may be useful because it will deal with some of the questions that we've got. So I will call Marianne and Doug to the front of the room. So just to welcome Marianne Bedard, you're the General Manager of SSHA, and Doug Rollins, Director of Housing Stability Services, SSHA.
Thank you to the committee for an opportunity to present. And thank you to the auditor for the time that her staff have spent with us. I think one of the things I want to say first off is that these systematic issues have existed for a really long time in SSHA. And as a new leader, I'm ready to take on immediate and direct action in order to address them. The responsibility for social housing has been transferred to the city. It came down in 2002. The RGI program is administered, as mentioned by the auditor, through a network of over 200 housing providers, largely not-for-profit, and through TCHC. The complex provincially controlled RGI rules have been in place for more than 20 years, and they do contain about 60 exemptions that housing providers have to navigate through in order to determine the correct amount of rent. SSHA has long been advocating to the provincial government to modernize and simplify the system. We're really happy to let you know that we have been successful in that advocacy, and in June, the province announced some legislative changes that are going to make a significant difference to us. We will be taking steps to improve our processes and our oversight, and it is clear that we need to do a better job. SSHA is already taking action, and we will prioritize our action in 3 areas over the next 90 days. We will be focusing on communication. In fact, our team has already sent communication to all our housing providers. We've shared the audit with them, and we've shared our intent to commence immediate reviews of RGI files. We will be prioritizing on the files identified by the auditor as having some issue, and then continuing on with the rest of the portfolio. We'll also be reviewing our training manuals and monitoring compliance of our housing providers with the new standards that are established. We'll also be focusing on eligibility and fraud detection. We're going to be enhancing eligibility verification and compliance. We'll be implementing a centralized database to monitor and track the status of the reviews. We'll be standardizing our consent forms and requiring housing providers to use the consent forms that are developed going forward, and we'll be monitoring their compliance with that. We'll also be paying some particular attention to our internal accountability. We'll be documenting our internal processes for consistency and monitoring compliance within our staff complement. We will be taking a look at developing local income and asset limits, and we'll be bringing those to Council for consideration in 2020. We're going to leverage our partnerships with other divisions who provide assistance to common clients and perhaps have more mature systems in place. And we will be submitting a business case for consideration in the 2020 budget process to establish some functions identified by the auditor, such as a quality assurance function or an eligibility review officer function. We think these actions will contribute to a culture of accountability that we will be embedding in all our actions going forward. I'd like to thank the auditor again for her report, and I look forward to reporting back to the chair of this committee on our progress. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll turn this over to committee if there are questions of staff on this. Councillor Nunziata?
Just one question. As far as subleasing, you're suggesting the driver's license. Who am I asking this question to? With subleasing, you're reviewing that through the driver's license, because I know I know a lot of tenants that are subleasing. For a fact, I've been told, and I know there's quite a few out there. So, by showing your driver's license, so how can we control that? Because it's happening, and a lot of it is happening. Yeah.
So I think the first step is to be top of mind and to be looking for it and then getting in underneath it. We simply did a review to look for the same names in different units and started our review like that. That's just a very simple way, and then we started to dig in and investigate each one, and we'll continue to do that. So I really think it starts with taking the data and analyzing it on spreadsheets to see what the anomalies and identifying those kinds of things is one way.
You pretty well have to go door to door to ask,
Well,
because it's very easy for them to give you false information when you knock on their door. And the list that we have isn't really accurate.
it can happen, but if you start there and then you open up an investigation into each one, and TCHD did a great job. They went face to face to get right in there, and they did a great job there. So I think the first thing is being aware of it. Second is to identify at a high level, at high risk. And then third is to verify, and once they're identified, the verification is going well.
Councillor, if I could just add as well, that's for us, that's the importance of collaborating with that actual housing provider, the one that's on the ground. It's difficult for us to know what's happening in the units, but the housing provider sees the daily comings and goings, and so working together with them on individual files, but also doing what the auditor did, where you take a look sort of from a mile high at where the similarities across the system.
Hear from other tenants. They know that, other tenants have a sublease. So thank you.
Are there any other questions? Councillor Fillion.
Very general question of the Auditor General. Do you think this file is getting under control? Do the measures that are being taken look like they will address your concerns?
It's really for management to demonstrate through their results and actions that the movement that will occur on the file. What I can say is that my team have already provided to management probably 1,000 items that have to be investigated, and they should be prioritized and investigated, but it's really going to be for management to demonstrate each quarter what the movement on the file.
Thank you, Councillor. Are there any other questions? Councillor Ford? So I'll ask a couple. A follow-on to that. What happens if someone is detected in a situation of fraud? They're subletting the household, they forged documents, they haven't declared some property. I think, if I've got it right, there's an eligibility review officer or officers. Have I got that right? Is that enabled under provincial regulation? And then, like, what is the outcome of that process? Are they asked to leave the home? Is the RGI removed and they're allowed to stay? Can you explain to us? What's the penalty?
So we don't have an eligibility review officer. That is one of the suggestions made by the auditor. It's a position that holds additional responsibilities and abilities than our regular staff. So we're certainly looking at what the opportunity is for us to develop that role. Basically, if you're found to have misrepresented your income in some way and you're not eligible for RGI, we will remove the RGI. Hopefully the tenant is able to pay market rent as opposed to losing their household. If possible, we don't want to disrupt households that are already in place, but certainly they would not continue to receive the benefit of an RGI.
Is there a possibility of criminal charges? Because is it a fraud situation?
It is a fraud situation, and we deal with those in that way.
So at the end of the day, I want to understand what the incentive is for somebody to be forthcoming on all the information, right? If today there's very little downside of making a mistake on the forms, let's call it a mistake for now. You know, like why would they worry if there is no outcome? But it sounds like the ERO is going to raise the stakes because that means somebody can get into the weeds and figure out what the bar is for somebody that has made an error versus somebody that has intentionally misled us.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, you know, our housing providers are not out to do a bad job. I think that we haven't had the proper oversight in place. Either way, for our housing providers, the rent gets paid. So it doesn't really matter who's paying the rent. So they're not incentivized necessarily in that way. The incentive would be that we're coming in and doing appropriate oversight and we're managing if they're not in compliance. And then also if we're asking them to manage their tenants in an appropriate way and maintain their eligibility.
I think this goes really to the heart of public confidence in the system. I think there was an example in here where there was a line that said Uber, right? And I'll go further. Tenants in a building that's maybe Toronto Community Housing say, people that live in that unit over there, they work for cash. They've got bags of money, and they're being treated the same as me, and I don't have bags of money. How do you resolve that situation? Because the stories are out there. We hear it as councillors, citizens hear those type of accusations. And finally, we're seeing, there's a system here where we're going to get really clever with getting information and trying to catch those situations. I want to feel assured as a committee member that, there's going to be a consequence when somebody is caught doing that type of stuff.
Well, I think one of the first lines of defense, as Councillor Nunziata said, it's neighbors and tenants that know what's happening. So how do we ensure that they have the adequate information to know when they can report, where and when they can report fraud, so that we can investigate those particular cases that aren't coming up through the oversight that we put into place. So I think that's one of the ways that we can enable that, so we get more opportunities to hear from people who have that experience. And then it is implementing a better oversight system so that we are doing both the individual reviews with housing providers about what's happening at their site, but then also doing the overview of the system as a whole to look for those similarities and where are we seeing common names coming up and those types of things. So it's doing things at a number of levels and then putting in the appropriate follow-up through staff to make sure that the appropriate actions are taken, that RGI is removed when people are found ineligible, and that, if required, that criminal charges are pursued.
Or recovery of the funds
Yes.
as a possible remedy. Because that's the point I want to make, is it may not just make somebody ineligible for RGI, but maybe they shouldn't be getting as much. And they can remedy it by paying it back. I also want to ask one other question, though, and it was just around that idea of looking at assets of individuals. So the auditor, I think, in the report has raised interesting public policy questions about, how do we consider what you own in determining how badly you need RGI? If I read this correctly, we only look at the ownership of property, and maybe even the ownership of property in Toronto or Ontario, and you can help guide me on that. But I don't think these the recommendations strengthen looking at those assets, the ones that are prescribed, the real property, but I'm not sure it goes so far as to put a public policy question before council. And I wondered what your take is on that. Do you see a day where, as council, we'll turn our mind to that? Is there a regulatory framework? Is it a council policy decision? Can we say, look, your bank account has 6 figures in it. Even though your income is low, you've got $100,000 in the bank, and maybe that needs to move you down on the RGI list. How are we going to grapple with that question? Or are we going to grapple with that question in your advice?
So we are grappling with that right now. We're in the process of doing a jurisdictional scan because it's managed differently across the province. Some jurisdictions have asset and or income limits. So we're looking at what would be appropriate for Toronto, and then we'll be bringing those recommendations forward to council for consideration.
So if I can play that back, there are other jurisdictions in the province that have asset thresholds, but we at the City of Toronto don't have that policy layer in place. For whatever reason, history to date, we don't look at somebody's holdings. We look at their income, and if they own property. Is it in Toronto, or is it in Ontario, or anywhere?
Yes, that is the case. We have opted to this point to not consider that.
Okay,
And it's just, we ask them if they own property, but I don't think that there is, as the auditor has done, a way of verifying whether or not they have titleship.
Okay, and so the vector for that policy question is not through this audit, but you're going to come to committee, or what can we expect?
Yes, so once we take a look at that jurisdictional scan and come up with a position that we would like to recommend to council, we'll bring it back. I think it would likely go through planning and housing, ECDC. I'm not quite sure. We'd have to look at the mandates of those two.
But through a committee, but not necessarily audit.
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
Fair enough, thank you. Any other questions? Members wishing to speak?
I have a motion.
Councilor Nunziata?
Put it on the screen. I won't speak out it. Just put it on the screen. I don't need to speak on it. Right there. I don't need to read every line. Everybody could read. Okay?
Thank you, Councillor. Anyone else wishing to speak? So I will then ask for a vote on, Councillor Fillion, you're good with that? These are report backs. So we'll ask for a vote on the amendments. All of those in favor? Any opposed? That is carried. And then on the item as amended, all of those in favor? Any opposed? And that is carried. Thank you.
We're at 7 now.
Thank you. So 7 was withdrawn, so we are at AU 4.8, Auditor General's Office 2020 operating budget. And we were going to hear that in conjunction with AU 4.9, which is the Auditor General's Office 2020 work plan. And we do have a speaker registered on AU 4.9. So since we're considering them together, I will ask Derek Moran to join us at the front. Welcome back to the Audit Committee, Derek. You know that you have 5 minutes. Please go ahead.
I just want to say, by me speaking at this meeting, this shall not be deemed to be in any way my consent expressed or implied in doing so as fraud. God bless Her Majesty the Queen. Long live Her Majesty the Queen. Let the record show I do not consent to the unconstitutional searches violating Section 8 of the Constitution Act 1982 that are currently taking place here at Toronto City Hall, as the province has never given the City of Toronto express statutory authority to do this. So in this report it says, City Council formally requested those agencies and corporations that are outside of the Auditor General's jurisdiction to allow the Auditor General to undertake any audits that she deems necessary. City Council also requested that the City of Toronto Act to be amended to extend the Auditor General's jurisdiction to include the Toronto Police Services Board, the Toronto Public Library Board, and the Board of Health. This change was not included as part of the revisions to the Act. Therefore, the Auditor General still does not have the authority to conduct a risk assessment or audit these boards without an invitation. To date, only the Toronto Public Library Board has requested the Auditor General to conduct a risk assessment of library operations. This will allow her to identify and prioritize potential future audits for the Toronto Public Library Board to consider. The Toronto Police Services Board has not invited the Auditor General to complete a risk assessment. So this is from an email that I recently sent to the City Manager, Chris Murray, over here, which I also copied to the Auditor General. Hi, Chris. So I noticed you taking notes while I spoke today at Budget Committee. Before a single cent of that $990,000 is spent on the street in front of the Northern District Library, is there any way you can first get the Auditor General and her team to investigate, take a look at what happened with the Northern District ramp, as I explained, and the money that was spent, wasted on that blatant make-work project? I wouldn't sink another cent into the Northern District, and get this, they're set to spend about another $13 million on that place over the next decade. Myself, I'd take that close to $14 million combined and just build a new proper 2-story library next to near the Toronto Community Centre complex. Or if Councillor Cole wants to save the Ann Johnson building so bad, move the Northern District Library into there, as that it is a 2-story building. And can you tell Marco Minicino I said hi if he drops by to see Mayor Tory sign Derek? To me, what happened with the ramp at the Northern District Library was just a mini bid rigging paving scandal by another name, which took over a year to finally complete. It's just a ramp. You go up the ramp, you go down the ramp. I respectfully direct the Auditor General to investigate what happened with the ramp at the Northern District Library before the Toronto Public Library is allowed to waste almost another $1 million on that place. Another thing about the Toronto Public Library Board is that City Council has somehow allowed them to get away with not filming their meetings and making them part of the public record on YouTube. So right off the bat, the Library Board flies under the radar and gets to avoid further scrutiny. A member of the public, the media, nor the Auditor General here has the chance of getting to see what was said at their meetings by going back and watching the recording. Now, something about the Toronto Police Services Board. That place is so shady that why recently, because the Auditor General before has said, as an accountant, you have to verify, right? I say to myself, hey, this definition for deputation that they use in their definition section in the Toronto Police Services Board's bylaw, it's complete opposite of the explanation of a deputation that your own deputy city clerk, John Elvidge, gave to me by email. So I say to myself, I email the police board and I say, hey, I want to go verify for myself, where did you guys get the definition for deputation that you use, right? I can't find it in any legal dictionary, normal dictionary. So I want to verify it for myself. What's the source of your definition for deputation? You know what the Toronto Police Services Board said when they got back to me? We can't give you that information because solicitor-client privilege. Can you believe that? Over a definition, they invoke solicitor-client privilege. So if they're hiding something as simple as that from you, think about it. What else are they hiding at the Toronto Police Services Board? So I just want to mention Legal Services Society versus British Columbia Information and Privacy Commissioner. 2003, Court of Appeal, British Columbia said that, in my opinion, should not overrule the public's right to know how tax dollars are being spent. Aventis Pasteur versus Canada Attorney General, 2004, federal court said, the public's right to know how government spends public funds as a means of holding government accountable for its expenditures is a fundamental notion of responsible government that is known to all except for the Toronto Police Services Board.
Thank you, Derek. Are there any questions of the speaker? Seeing none, Derek, I'll say thank you, and I know that you know that there's the fraud and waste hotline, and please don't feel shy. I saw the auditor taking notes at the beginning when you were talking about the library ramp, but it's a good example and a good message for everybody listening that there's a really good gateway. You don't have to come down to the committee meeting. There's a good gateway to bring those observations through, and they are looked at.
But you're such a good guy, Councillor Holiday. I come down here anyways just to
Well, thank you.
hang out with you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for talking to us today. Okay. Scott, you speak to it. Okay, I know we have some presentations on this, but in the interest of time, and the auditor, I think, is going to make some comments for us.
Yes, so I've been asked to keep my comments to about 5 minutes. So I just wanted to let you know that we have been delivering on the projects that were identified last year. We start our risk assessment process this year. The budget we'll be asking for is really the floor, which is the budget we have now, which is 0.005, which is 1/20th of 1% of the city's operational budget. So it's 1/20th of 1%. With the added programs that we're being asked for today, cybersecurity update quarterly, plus potentially other any other higher risk cyber areas, plus looking at police, what we're going to be asking for is an increase from 0.005 to 0.0055. So it's basically about the permanent being the 0.05. That's our permanent base that we need, but just a little bit more, which is ends up being about 700,000 to cover off those added risks to get our program, full-time round the clock, to get any outstanding risks identified and addressed in a proactive way so that management can continue to act. So there's the cyber risk. The other risk is our fraud risk. We have a great fraud team, but capacity is always a challenge. And then library, police, and health are the other areas that we want to look at. So that's our request.
Thank you. So just a reminder, members, we're at items 4.9 and 4.10. So that's both the Auditor General's budget.
Plan.
Pardon me. Thank you, Madam Clerk.
8 and 8.9.
It is. Thank you.
Okay.
It is 4.8 and 4.9.
Okay. Can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
Okay, just a quick question, and then on 8.10, I have a motion, and then I'm going to have to leave. So for the to the Auditor General for your work plan for 2020, I know I spoke to you about some issues I had on when we go up for tender on projects, and we repeatedly at government management get these reports where we're under budget, and there's been a request for increased funding for these projects, and we spoke about that. And are you going to be looking at that?
Thank you.
Looking at all the tendering process?
So thank you. We have this year finished our engineering project where we did identify control areas that had to be tightened up to make sure that they would not be going over in some of the tenders as they did change orders. We are going to be doing certain contract areas, snow removal, those kinds of areas. So we'll continue to monitor on a project, I guess, a project theme basis. If the committee would like an analysis of which contracts go over in general, if you thought that was important, I'd take it away to consider that for a project. Like as a theme overall. I would move a request that, just in general, to have an analysis completed and any work done around the contracts going over, just to see if there's any themes there that maybe could improve that from happening.
Do you want to stand this down? Yeah. Do you want to stand this down? Do you want to draft a motion?
I wouldn't mind standing.
Okay. I think we'll be fairly quick on the next couple of items, but if it gives us 5 minutes, we get a chance to get the motion in place before council. So we'll stand down item 4 point, talking about, yeah, we'll do both 8 and 9. We'll stand them down for a moment. Councillor Fillion, I'm just going to give you the forewarning. Number 10. We're going to go to number 10, which I think you held.
Okay, so number 10, I have a motion.
So hang on here. I've got Councillor Fillion as the member that held it. Did you have questions on it?
Okay.
So I'll read the title: Auditor General's 2019 Consolidated Status Report on Outstanding Audit Recommendations, AU 4.10.
There are several, a general question of the Auditor General. There are several kind of overlapping reports in here dealing with sort of the same we have several reports dealing with recommendations not being implemented, outstanding recommendations, et cetera, et cetera. So there have already been assurances and motions adopted on that subject broadly. Are there additional items in this report that haven't been covered and that require further attention other than what's already been done this meeting?
Thank you for the question. I think everybody understands where the potential challenges are, and I also think that the city management, with their new system that they are bringing forth, and the reporting in, is going to be helpful for them and helpful for us. So maybe look for next quarter and see, how that's working. I think everybody has the message, and I think we can probably move forward because I think they've got the system underway, and people have a better understanding of what should be in there.
Mr. Campbell, did you want to add to that, just about how? I know it's the other report, but
this is the consolidation of everything.
This is the consolidation, but the other report is going to pick up. The consolidation has a time lag at which you report, Madam Auditor, but
that's great.
Your report addresses concerns immediately. I'm sorry, you don't have a mic.
Yeah.
No. I think this will help with the question.
Sure. So in terms of our database we've put together right now, it includes all recommendations up to the last audit committee meeting. We'll get it populated with the ones out of this meeting as well. So in other words, with the Auditor General's follow-up schedule, it's usually about, Beverly, correct me if I'm wrong, 18 months to 2 years. Correct. So we'll be tracking them in advance of that very proactively. So in other words, management within the city, the DCM team, Chris, we can more proactively track and assess the adequacy of progress made against those recommendations and the action plans.
And how does that feed into this committee?
You'll get a quarterly report. So we will bring back to this table starting in February 2020. Detailed statistics on the status of percentage of recommendations completed, along with some attached spreadsheets with the specific granular recommendations we're referring to.
Okay. That's coming to every meeting anyway. We don't need any further motions to direct that happen.
Yeah, and if I may augment the questioning just to help with this, if I've got the genesis of AU 4.10 right, this is the Auditor General's 2019 Consolidated Status Report.
Correct.
The Auditor General has and will continue to report on tranches of outstanding or resolved audit recommendations.
Correct.
And that is the council process to discharge those recommendations once they're completed. However, they occur in tranches. So you're going back to December 31st, 2017 is your benchmark on this report, because the other items are too new and are being worked on. I've got that right.
Correct.
The other case, though, which is new, and it's, although it's straying into another report, is that we will have management come to us with a red-hot, fresh list of audit recommendations being tracked comprehensively right throughout, all the way back in time. So it's an extensive list. But the difference is it will pick up audit recommendations almost as immediately as they're put out. So we will have a hot list every quarter for us to look at as a committee. Did I get all of those pieces right?
Yes.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, Councillor Nunziata, do you have questions or you just want to speak to it?
No, I just want to move my motion.
Okay,
Yeah, so it's on the screen. City Council, do you need me to read it?
I think we're okay. I mean,
You're okay?
just paraphrase. You're just gonna.
So
you're just
City
gonna have
Council
a report.
direct the city manager to report to the audit committee without, of all outstanding audit recommendations for the city manager's office, all city divisions within community and social services, corporate services, finance, treasury services, and infrastructure and development services in the city's agencies and corporations, with the report to include detailed plans and timelines for implementation of all recommendations not yet fully implemented.
Any other members wishing to speak? All those in favor of the amendment? Any opposed? And that is carried. On the item as amended, all those in favor? Any opposed? And that is carried. You guys okay? Okay, so we'll go to 11. We're almost ready on that. Councillor Filion, now have you marked down as holding item number 11?
Yes, and I'm okay with that now. But I understand you
Okay.
were,
Yep, I've got a motion, but are there any questions on 11? So I'll read the full title. AU 4.11, Auditor General's Office Forensic Unit Status Report on Outstanding Recommendations. Any members wishing to ask questions on this? Seeing none. Any members wishing to speak on this? Seeing none. Therefore, I'll speak. I have a very brief, and this is, again, another follow-up request. If I may ask the clerk to put it on the screen. So we're going to ask the CFO and treasurer to report to the committee at the next meeting on the one high-priority outstanding recommendation that is mentioned in this report, which is improving reporting and monitoring of employee benefits. And the clerk has inserted the actual wording out of the report. Just so we're clear on that, it's a report request to the next meeting. All of those in favor of the amendment? Any opposed? That is carried. And on the item as amended?
Sure.
All those in favor? Any opposed? And that is carried. So we'll go to number 12 before we go back. I think we're almost ready on that motion. So AU 4.12, that is the process to track and report on the implementation of outstanding Auditor General recommendations. Councillor Filion, you had held that report, although we just talked about it.
yes, I think I'm okay.
Are there any other members with questions on this item? Any members wishing to speak? I'm happy to take a motion. So it's a motion to receive for the audit committee. May I take a motion for that? Councillor Filion. All those in favor of the motion? Any opposed? And that is carried. So we will go back to our single remaining items, which is item 8 and 9. And Councillor Nunziata, I think your motion is ready.
Yeah, sorry, I'd meant to. So if I could ask it as a question, because I don't have a motion ready. So I have an issue that concerns me, and
So we'll go to questions on this. We're on the last item.
Yeah, so this was something I had intended to do myself, but it'd be much better if someone else did it. My suspicion was, because the limit is 500,000, that there are probably a lot that come in at 499,000. So I asked for a list and was about to, and there are a lot. I don't know what percentage of them are close to the 500,000, but there were quite a few. So I wanted to have a look at that. So I pulled the list, and I was about to review them all with staff when other events overtook my amount of time I had to do that. So is that the kind of thing you would look at in a, I think it, I'm just looking at Councillor. Councillor Nunziata's motion is quite broad. Is that the type of thing you would be looking at?
In a contract management audit, yes, and in that kind of audit, we did find, we looked at that when we looked at some of the engineering contracts, so that would be something we would include. It's not uncommon, so if that's a request, we can look at that also.
Do I need to make that as a motion, or is that just something you would?
Duly noted. It's noted for us.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Filion. Are there any other questions of staff before we take it into committee? Councillor Nunziata, you want to speak?
Yeah, just my motion on the screen.
Okay, and the motion is straightforward.
Yeah.
The clerk is just asking for some clarification that, are you looking for a report, or is it an intention to request the Auditor General to consider it, or? So we'll modify that. Yep, we just want to get it in a form that's in order. So perhaps to buy a little bit of time, I've got another motion I'll ask to put on the screen. So I had my own. I don't need to speak to it for very long, but it's quite clear. We would recommend to City Council that City Council ask the Toronto Police Services Board and the Toronto Public Health Board to invite the Auditor General to complete a risk assessment of operations in order to inform potential audit projects on future work plans. So the auditor in her report to us talked about her jurisdiction and made note that due to the structure and the governance that we have, she's not able to audit these two entities the same way that she does other departments of the city. Essentially, those boards need to invite her in. This request is not a complete opening of the doors. It's really to say, auditor, come here, please do a risk assessment, talk to our board about what projects we should be working on in the future. When we talked a little bit earlier in some of our other audit discussions today, we talked about having an enterprise view of things. But when certain segments of the overall enterprise or of the government at large are counted out, it's really hard to claim that we've got an enterprise. I can only hope that the council will approve this and that those entities will also have give serious consideration to our ask as council, because it really is about strengthening government. So I hope members will support that. Certainly. I believe we've done this in the past. Do we just not get it? Do they get back to us and say no, or do they just never get back to us? To be honest, I'd have to ask the Auditor General about how they responded. I just know that this had come up in other previous commentary from the Auditor General, and we've asked it in various ways of these two entities, please, allow the auditor just to conduct that risk assessment. But they have to take that step to let us in at the board level.
So I understand what I'm trying to find out is we should make sure we get a response, and if it's a no, then we should figure out how we might turn that into a yes.
The response from the police board, I was invited in to do an analysis of carding and level 3 and 4 strip searches, but there was work already under that in those areas by other bodies, so the value for money at this stage was not good to duplicate at the same time. But there's been changes at the board, and I've already sent a letter to the police board. I'm hoping that they'll invite me, and hopefully they will see the work we've been doing and invite us in.
Well, actually, just on that point, it was brought up at the Police Services Board meeting the other day, which I attended. We talked about it, so, yeah.
So can we add, and that the, either the AG or the chair report back to this committee on what happens with this request?
More than happy to amend it that way, and Beverly's shaking her head that she can get that implemented. If members comfortable if it doesn't go on the screen, I just don't want to hold up the meeting any longer. But okay, so we've got two amendments on the floor. I'll ask the committee to consider Councillor Nunziata's amendment. All those in favor? Any opposed? That's carried. Got my amendment on the floor as amended by Councillor Fillion's suggestion. All those in favor? Any opposed? And that is carried. And on the item as amended, all those in favor? Any opposed? And that is carried. I think that is it. So meeting adjourned. Thank you, everybody, for all of your attention. It's been a long day, and I appreciate everyone